transcendent belief system that people subscribe to, it is not the actual damage. Like, the damage isn't in the belief system so much as it is in those control mechanisms that go across every area of life.
Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to another episode of The Greatest Comeback, a podcast that explores the transformational power of adversity and how it can be the catalyst for our growth, healing, and becoming the greatest versions of ourselves. I have always been fascinated by cults. There you go, I've said it. In my 20s, I was captured by David Koresh and his followers in Waco and was glued to the television set as I saw FBI agents raiding that compound. I was fascinated by Heaven's Gate and the ritual suicide that took place when 39 members decided to end their lives together. I was fascinated by Charles Manson and the Manson Group. I don't know what it is, but there's something about cults that has always drawn me in and drawn my attention to the subject. And maybe it's because society is so enamored with the free and easy way of living, particularly in Australia, that we balk at the idea of having our freedoms infringed upon and being coerced into living a lifestyle that perhaps isn't the lifestyle of our own choosing. So I think in many ways, that's really the reason why I've been drawn to cults as a topic. But my interest in cults also extends to finding one's way out of them. If you're born into a cult, if your entire family is part of a cult, how on God's green earth do you find your way out of that? How do you come back from that? What does life look like when you're outside of that cult? Well, today's guest is the co-founder and president of Survivors of Coercive Cults and High Control Groups, a support group that recently submitted a report titled Beyond Belief, great title by the way, to an inquiry in Victoria about cults, advocating for regulations against harmful practices within these groups. She's also the estranged daughter of a fundamentalist pastor in a now infamous high control sect. She escaped that highly political, dominionist group and later became a national whistleblower. With a history in strategic communications, community service, and youth policy, her passion now lies in research and law reform. She hosts the Unchurchable podcast and writes on Substack under evangelical explainer Clare Heath-McIvor. Welcome to The Greatest Comeback.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. It's weird hearing you read that bio. I'm like, really? That's me? Oh,
is that me?
She sounds incredible. Who's
she sounds amazing. I must meet her.
Yeah.
Claire, straight out of the gates, I mean, you heard that intro. What, in your opinion, what is it about cults? Having been in one and having come out of one and having, forged a life outside of that upbringing, what is it do you think is so enthralling about the idea of a cult?
Oh, that's even I'm fascinated with cults, and I deal with survivors every day and I deal with public policy every day. But I get it, I get why cults are so fascinating. And I think it fundamentally has to do with the other. Whenever there's a big divide between us ideologically or whether it's culturally, we look to the other and we try to understand it and we contrast ourselves with it. And I think a lot of people look at cults as the other and they look at people go, well, how did they end up in that? Or how did they believe that? And we're kind of thinking, could I ever be caught up in something like that as well? And something that we've been exploring over the course of this inquiry in Victoria is that cults are not a phenomenon of belief. They're a phenomenon of control and domination. Usually that's control of money, sex, power, or all three, or a combination of all three. And, it's the transcendent belief system that people subscribe to. It is not the actual damage. Like, the damage isn't in the belief system so much as it is in those control mechanisms that go across every area of life, whether it's, relational, social, existential, financial, cognitive, behavioral, the whole thing. It's not about that belief system. It's about those systems of control. I think it's a fascinating thing for people to look at, and sort of the first question that people usually ask is, oh, was there any weird sex stuff? And you're like, really? That's where you're going? Like, but
that was my second question.
Yeah, nicely done, Luke. I knew it. And I often joke back that you got to be careful whether you're joining a sex cult or an anti-sex cult. They've both got really bad sides to them. But what we've found over the course of the inquiry is that it's the same mechanisms that boils the frog slowly. It's the indoctrination by degrees. It's the love bombing that is so intoxicating in the beginning and so destabilizing when it's pulled away from you. But the vast majority of people who responded to the inquiry, 63.4%, I think, were either born into cults or joined through a loved one or an intimate partner who then brought them into a cult. So it's not like people are taking flyers from street preachers and getting sucked in that way by and large. That was only sort of 10% that were being recruited that way. It's your relationships, and often it's a misfortune of birth that means that you're actually brought into these cults. So, yeah, but I do get it. They're always going to be fascinating because they're always going to look and go, would I have been sucked in? And the answer is yes, you very well could have been.
Yeah. I think do you think that the word cult has been conscripted and overused? I kind of balk, in preparing for this conversation and kind of dipping my toe into this subject matter, I just got the sense that there was some sensitivity around the word. And, all the websites I went to, there was this, I wouldn't call it a substitution, but coercive control seemed to be the preferred way of framing that circumstance rather than cult. Is there some sensitivity to that word within the community?
Yeah, there is. And that's why the organisation I founded has got such an unwieldy name, the Survivors of Coercive Cults and High Control Groups, because we do need to have both in there. I think linguistics is something that is so interesting because the word cult matters greatly to survivors. Without that word, like if someone was to say to me, you were in a high control group, I'd go, yeah, and? But if they say to me, you were in a cult, there is an element of shock and meaning to that can help people scrutinize what they're in and can help them scrutinize whether or not they need to get out of it, or it can help them identify that they're actually a victim in this system. I did a piece on my Substack yesterday. People often call themselves a victim or a survivor or a victim survivor of cults, but my argument was that there's actually another two labels that are missing from that. One is expert. Cult survivors are experts in their own stories, but the first label a lot of us identify with is actually villain, because they blame us for our own abuse, or they blame us for not being able to conform when we're shunned, things like that. And if we're shunned from a high control group, they can maintain the power over us, and they can maintain this status almost like they're right and we're wrong. And that's really, it's DAVO, deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender. That's something that happens to so many cult survivors. But unless you can have the language to wrap around what happened to you, it can be really hard to recover and it can be really hard to escape. And that is something that's called, epistemic abuse. And that's a trauma of not knowing what happened and not being able to understand and have words for it. So the word cult matters greatly to survivors. There is this divide in the world of research over the cultic studies crowd and the new religious movement crowd. The new religious movement crowd, we call them cult apologists because they have this argument, a lot of them, that not all cults are damaging, and the word cult is too sort of rage baity, it's too pejorative. I think the word cult should be pejorative. There, I said it. But while the term cult serves survivors, it doesn't serve legislation or law reform, because there's too much baggage around that term, and law reform and policy needs to be specific. So in the Beyond Belief paper, we mapped out a risk, pattern, harm sort of a matrix. We mapped out the legitimacy of coercion, because obviously, like, the tax office can coerce you if you're not paying your taxes, and the cops can coerce you into, driving under the speed limit or wearing your seatbelt. Coercive powers do exist in government to keep us all in line, but it's when that moves beyond the legitimate and moves into areas it shouldn't be, forcing you to give large sums of money, forcing you to not partake in certain, relationships, not being able to be in relationships with outsiders, not being able to read certain books or, consume certain media, or, when you're coerced across these other financial, relational, social, all these other places, that's where the problem lies. So in the Beyond Belief paper, we actually mapped out 205 of those, 205 coercive acts, and had a look at where they actually sat in other areas of law, because labour exploitation is really common in cults. Excessive volunteerism or forced volunteerism, coerced volunteerism. We heard from an ex-Carmelite nun on Monday. She gave a presentation to the committee, and she had been in the order for 60 years, not paid, hard labour the whole time, spent most of that in silence. That's a huge amount of coercive control and exploitation. Her fertile years, all gone. She had to learn to use her voice again on the way out, and, after her shunning. And it was a heartbreaking story, but a really common one in terms of the degree of control that people end up having taken from them. So, I think the word cult, I see the baggage, but that's why we've started saying coercive cults and high control groups. And then we've started talking to government about group-based coercive control. That is, coercive control is the harm, and group-based is the context that it sits in, just like intimate partner coercive control sits within the container of that intimate partner relationship. So the Venn diagrams overlap, but they're not complete circles.
Yeah. I tell you what, this has been such an education for me in terms of going down this rabbit hole and finding out things that I had no idea about. And I think it's probably worthwhile for the listeners recounting how I came into contact with you. Obviously the algorithm matched us, and I saw you on it was a TikTok video talking about the value of ethical storytelling. And I thought, what the hell is ethical storytelling? And why would that be important for a cult survivor? But then I went to your website, I downloaded the media kit, and I thought, I get it. This is a group of people that have, in many ways, have been manipulated for the better part of their lives. They're getting out of these circumstances, and their story is being manipulated. They are being manipulated for the currency of their story as clickbait or something to drive eyeballs or readership. Can you comment to the importance of ethical storytelling in your space?
Thank you for that. That is, I'm so stoked that you read the media guide, first of all. We've been sort of forcing it down the throats of journalists over the course of the last 6 months as this inquiry's been happening. But look, when people are in cults, they are so voiceless. Somebody else is deciding what their story is. Somebody else is deciding when they're believed and when they're not, and the context in which they're placed, and the narrative about their lives. And that continues after you leave. Often these groups want to continue to have control over how your story is told. And like we've seen that in the blowback against some people who've popped their hand up to speak. And it's very scary, but it's also the only way that the cult phenomenon can be truly understood. And what we've found is that most cult survivors have had this us and them persecution complex built in. We're scared of the outside world. We've been told it's evil. We've been told that once we remove ourselves from the covering or the transcendent belief system, that all sorts of evils are going to befall us. And stepping out into the world is terrifying. And it takes us some time to sort of reorient ourselves to start feeling safe in our own bodies, our own minds, our own homes and our own communities. And let me say to you, it is absolutely better on the outside if you're scared of making that jump. We have people who can help you there. But inevitably, as part of the healing journey, people go, I want to tell my story. And there's always willing listeners. But often people want to tell their story in a way that can create meaningful change. And there's been this tendency to just speak to anyone who will listen. Having been a whistleblower, I know what this is like. I was in a privileged position because my ex-husband and I had been quite involved in politics prior to our us being managed out the door and functionally shunned. He dealt with media a lot, and I was working in communications. That was sort of our role within the group, was a lot of that public facing stuff, creating a lot of communications assets. So I knew the game. I also knew that it was going to be sort of 6 months of intensity, and then once the story drops, you might not ever hear from that journalist again. You also know that, I also knew that once my story was gone from my hands, I couldn't control how other people reacted to it. I couldn't control whether they looked at me a certain way, or I couldn't choose how 60 Minutes or The Age decided to write about me in their publications. I couldn't choose how other publications were going to react to that. And that is terribly destabilizing for somebody who doesn't have an internal locus of control. Then there's also, on top of that, on top of the expectations, on top of that exposure, on top of the possibility of blowback, there is this issue of clickbait and this issue of rage bait in driving ratings. And a lot of the times, journalists will focus on the salacious stuff. They'll focus on the sex stuff, or they'll focus on, in our case, gay conversion practices, arranged marriages. That sort of thing becomes the most, it's got the most pizzazz, it's got the most draw. But for us, it's not the most insidious part of the journey. And that can be really frustrating for people as well, going, you're just wanting the gory details and you're not wanting to know how my agency was taken away. You might be looking at me going, you're gullible, or how did you fall for this? And you don't fully understand that it was by degrees, and there was social pressure, and there was family involvement, and there was ideological uptake, and there was sleep deprivation, and there was indoctrination, and all of that. I mean, I was born in, this was just my worldview. So all of these pieces, when they come together, can mean that the natural curiosity that people have about cults drives the story into a zone that actually re-traumatizes the cult survivor. But, that's why the media guide was created, so they can actually ethically engage, as in journalists can ethically engage. They can make sure the survivor knows the expectations. They can make sure that they've got support. They can make sure that they've got counselling or debrief afterwards, things like this. And they can make sure that we're using terminology that can contribute to meaningful change instead of just contribute to a lot of clicks on a website and, people poring over the gory, salacious details.
You mentioned the word blowback. What are the real world risks to survivors in telling their stories?
Yeah, well, look, I will give you a pretty intense example at the end of this, and this had happened last week when we chatted. I was still sort of in the aftershocks, but a lot of people, when they first come out of cults, will try to keep quiet so that they're not harassed, or so they're not stalked, or so that they can try to maintain some relationship with, family who might be on the inside. Sadly, often that can't happen, and the shunning or the excommunication is quite firm. So a lot of the time people just don't speak up. And then when an opportunity happens to speak to the media or whatnot, they might try to use a pseudonym, which then means that journalists are less likely to tell the story because they need a name. So this is something that happened with the Geelong Revival Centre. Their survivors, led by Ryan and Catherine Carey, who set up Stop Religious Coercion Australia and who really got the inquiry up. It was a podcast series by Richard Baker who did that first, but it wasn't until Ryan and Catherine said, we'll use our names, that other people were like, okay, if you will, I will. And then there was safety in numbers coming up behind them. But like me, Ryan and Catherine had a certain degree of prominence in the group before they left. I'm a pastor's daughter. My dad is the head honcho, whereas Ryan's dad was an assistant pastor. So there was a certain degree of social privilege that they had and that I had. But in terms of blowback, like a lot of the inquiry submissions are confidential or name withheld because of this. A lot of cults are in small towns. It's easy for fringe groups to pop up in rural or remote areas, I think because of leveraging people's need for community or leveraging the lack of community services. It means that they can target people during times of loss or transition or whatnot. So it's a profound act of courage to tell your story in a way that the hometown people who know where you live and work are going to read it. And that is really scary. Like, I had moved 200 kilometres from my hometown by the time that I was brave enough to stop using a pseudo and to go, face to camera for 60 minutes. That was something that I needed. I knew that the home crowd knew what my pseudonym was anyway, but I just didn't want to be associated with the church and its political efforts before I was ready. But yeah, so there's a lot of fear that people like the cult might know where they live and might come and confront them at their place of employment or might make life difficult that way. And they are, safety is something that needs to be considered above all. I've also find that for most cults, their bark is worse than their bite, thankfully, and it's the fear and the intimidation that perpetuates control. But, safety is something that you've got to follow your gut on. It really is. But what happened with me is the parliamentary inquiry was accepting submissions for 3 months, and they shut on, I think, the 31st of July or August. My home crew knew that I'd be putting in a submission just because I speak up a lot about cults, and I had founded this group and I'd founded the Australian Cult Survivors Network as part of that. So they knew that I'd be putting in a submission. They also guessed that my ex-husband would. They also still had a bee in their bonnet about the fact that we'd spoken out about them. So they created a 106-page dossier to try to discredit us, and they submitted it to the inquiry, which got published a couple of Mondays ago. And when I tell you, it just ripped the wind out of my sails that day. I was devastated that my story had been completely rewritten. I was reading it going, that didn't happen. But another survivor, a trans man, had been misgendered. They'd gotten a statement from somebody close to him to try to discredit him. They'd gotten another victim to write and say that he wasn't traumatized by what had happened to him. And I read it and I was devastated because for a moment I forgot that I was an expert. I forgot that I was the survivor. I went right back to being a victim. And as I read through that, it was the fear of what this would do to other survivors ripped the wind out of my sails. And I then went and my ex-husband, because his sexuality was core to his story, because he was put through gay conversion practices and then gay conversion therapy as part of our experience there. Our marriage was arranged, and those stories were completely rewritten. And that was just devastating. It was really, really devastating. And I woke to calls from journalists. I hadn't known that the dossier had gone live. My sister's a politician, and that day she had helped deliver, or she was about to help deliver, a letter to the opposition leader to trigger a leadership spill in the Liberal Party in Victoria. And I was just like, oh God, they're going to use this to blow that up. There was, I was told that the church had offered a exclusive to a large newspaper in Victoria, and I was just like, they're going to trash us all over the media. And I thought, I'm going to let survivors down. They'd also gone to the Speaker of the Assembly to try to get her to lean on the inquiry, which is Committee on Confidence. They're not supposed to interfere with the process there, but they were really upset that they hadn't got a hearing so that they could try to discredit me because I'd gotten a hearing. And it was really, really terrifying, because I'm out here doing this work of survivor advocacy and law reform, and I'm aware that I have a privilege that other people don't have, in that I've had a lot of therapy. I had a lot of access and privilege inside the group. I knew I was going to be believed. I had media expertise. That's a lot of privilege that not all cult survivors have, and I hate that it is so, but it is so. And the fear and the feeling like once again you're being made the villain and having your story taken out of your hands is terrifying. So we managed the crisis.
I can hear it in your voice. I can. As you're, I mean, how many years has it been now that you've been out?
Oh, well, that's an interesting timeline. Technically, it is 10 years since our shunniversary. Sorry about that. It's 10 years since our shunniversary, but it takes a while to actually remove yourself physically and mentally. So the trigger for us was a high-risk pregnancy, and an argument between my then husband and my dad. And we found out about the pregnancy the same day that argument happened. I then argued for 4 months because I was like, this is my family. We need to fix this. We need to stay. This can't be our legacy, that sort of thing. And eventually my health deteriorated to the point where my blood pressure was up over 200. And the doctor was like, you can choose your stressor or you can choose your health and your pregnancy, but you can't have both. And it was really detrimental. But then we tried to play nice for 3 years, and we tried to hold on to our faith. And and we've landed in different places on that. There was all sorts of things to grapple with on the road out. So I only actually stopped going to church during COVID, but I was going to a different church. I started the blog and I started the podcast when I was still identifying as Christian, but moving in a more progressive direction. I joke now that I'm an atheist before 9 a.m. on a Monday, and I'm a Christian when I need to find a car park at a Westfield before Christmas. But, probably agnostic is where I fit. And I do think spirituality is a beautiful thing to engage with if you can do it in a healthy way. And I think sometimes we just need to be able to have prayer as an option that's available to us. But I vacillate, and, I couldn't use the word Christian if I tried now because of the baggage attached to it. So, yeah. But yes, it's deeply personal to go through something like that. And I never want to be cavalier about it, because these are still people I love, but cannot have in my life. I've got 2 beautiful kids now, and they are the barometer by which I measure, my life. And there's so much that I'm saving them from being exposed to by maintaining this estrangement. There wasn't an estrangement that I kicked off, but it is one that I am keeping in place out of consideration for my children and out of consideration for me. But they are still people I love so much, and I don't know where my siblings are in all of this. I don't know where my mother is in all of this. It was wounding to read a statement from my dad that did not reflect the events that actually took place. To see that on a parliamentary website and then to see the media releases go to different media outlets, I was like, holy cow. And then I was like, well, I did this to them too. Like, I went on 60 Minutes, but then I'm like, hang on. I did it so that this sort of Trumpian agenda, this sort of anti-trans, anti-LGBT, anti-women's rights agenda could not be advanced. And trigger warning, consider whether you skip the next 2 minutes of this podcast. But just this morning I read of a trans person losing their life suddenly, and it knocked the winds out of my sails, because I'm like, I spoke up so that this damage couldn't continue. And I'm not saying the church has got anything to do with it, but she was a social justice advocate who'd come up against them. And I don't know, like, I think there was a lot of other things that would have contributed to her sudden death. But these are the people that I had in my mind and my heart, that when I spoke up, is I wanted people to be safe. I didn't want trans people or LGBT people to think that there was any validity to other people questioning their stories or pushing back at their rights. And I didn't want a political movement to sort of spring up that legitimise these anti-trans ideas. But, of course, we've seen a lot of this in Victoria over the course of the last 3 years. The anti-trans movement has been huge. Fringe or fundamentalist Christian groups have been very much a part of this. And also the emergence of the neo-Nazi groups, the NSN. Just this week, they were in the news. Their leader, Tom Sewell, has been trying to, there's been homeschooling that's been going on, which pulls kids out of any protective system. And, I was homeschooled. And so the kind of things that are not picked up, like medical neglect or all of this sort of thing. And it just, even though this trans person who died yesterday had nothing to do with my old church, even though they were in the same advocacy space and they'd faced off a couple of times, I believe, you just, you go, oh, these are the people I spoke out for. But still, the people who raised me and the people who were my entire world until I was 32 years old, they're the people who tried to trash me in the newspaper. And that's hurtful. It is really hurtful. And so I'm absolutely not saying they had anything to do with this person's death, but just the proximity I found really confronting. So just please know that.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you've had to go through that. The English author Jeanette Winterson, she was a member of a Pentecostal community in the UK, and she was also a lesbian. She wrote extensively about that experience. In one of her books, she says the tricky thing about coercion is that it can look a lot like love.
Yeah, girl.
Isn't that a great line? How do you come up with, given the fact that coercion can look a lot like love, how do you define what coercive group control is? How do you define a cult?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is not to define a cult. That is the first. Legislatively, my suggestion to government has been that they don't define a cult. Because as soon as they do, that means that the state is now saying what is normal belief and what is abnormal belief. And that's not a role that we should have in a democracy that values separation of powers. We don't have the right to decide what is okay to believe and what is not. But what we have a responsibility to is vulnerable people, and we have a responsibility to make sure that people behave well and people don't damage other people where possible. So there's been this whole religious freedom argument during this, and just on Monday, our policy head got asked that question, and he said, what are we looking for here? Are we looking for two different standards? So everybody else has to abide by the law, but you want religious freedom so that you can what? Abuse children, or so that you can, like, what are you asking for here? And I thought it was a really brilliant way to put it. Cults, like I said before, the word cult is important to survivors. It's important to academics in the sociology and psychology space because, and I use Dr. Janja Lalich's definition of a cult, which is nice and easy. It has 4 elements. A cult usually has a central charismatic or narcissistic character who commands a lot of obedience, unquestioning obedience or adulation, that sort of thing. It has a transcendent belief system. It has systems of influence by which people are, recruited in, indoctrinated in, and influenced to come right in under that control. And they have systems of control to keep people there. So those 4 elements in Dr. Janja's definition that I just butchered then, that's sort of how I define it. And every other version of the cult definition will be closely linked to that in some way. That central charismatic or narcissistic character, their transcendent belief system, the control and influence mechanisms. That's important for sociology. It's important for survivors. It's important for therapists. It's important for psychology. When it comes to the law, there needs to be a threshold. There needs to be some observable things. We've suggested a tiered approach. So if you've just visualize a triangle with 2 lines through the middle, so you've got 3 tiers. The bottom, the chunky tier, is about education and prevention and research. And then that middle tier is the civil level, and that's where you can be like, okay, I'm seeing a structural risk here in this organisation. Let's work with an educator, or let's work with a consultant who can help us shore up these safety measures in the structure of a group. And then you've got your civil damages if harm has occurred, and you've got your criminal damages if harm has occurred right at the top. So yes, there should be some criminality to this, but that's up the severe end. Where we went with beyond belief is that we broke up 6 kind of domains of life. And if you'll just excuse me for a second, I will go into my text messages and find you an image here so I can talk clearly to it. You can probably edit this bit out. Say hi to your audio engineer for me. So basically there are 6 domains here that we look at. The first is behavioural. The second is linguistic. The third is existential. The fourth is cognitive. The fifth is social, and the sixth is emotional. So these are the 6 areas that we've looked at. Now, some of this is internal. It's going to be hard to measure how somebody is thinking or internalizing, but you can measure behavior. You can measure different pressures, different levers that are being pulled. So we have put forward a model that says that group-based coercive control is patterned harm across multiple domains of life that amounts to totalistic control of an individual. And that is the point at which an individual no longer has freedom of thought, no longer has freedom of choice, is living under a surveillance culture where they believe their choices are being, seen, influenced, monitored, watched, or punished. Even when they're away from the group, they're going to still feel that internal control, and there's still going to be blowback if they're discovered. So it's that cumulative patterned harm over all of these different domains. So that's how we're looking at it. We've suggested that group-based is a better word for legislation and law because it's the context within which coercive control occurs. And then it doesn't matter. You don't have to have this hurdle of, is it a cult, in order for, did serious harm occur Was it, should it have happened? And, was the coercive control lawful, proportional, justified, authorized? Was it legal, essentially? And the answer in the vast majority of cases is no. So that's how we've put it forward. And like I said, separation of powers is important, but religious freedom is not the freedom to defraud, exploit, abuse, or deceive. It's just not. And so in putting forward this group-based coercive control legislation, what we're saying is don't worry about defining a cult according to the law. Worry about what a healthy community looks like. Worry about putting structural protections in for vulnerable people. Make sure that there are, financial transparency measures. Make sure that there's adequate supervision. Make sure that there are grievance procedures. Make sure that it's not a leader who answers to no one. There's all these different elements that we can bring into this to build up the health of an organisation rather than to just go around cult bashing. It's complex, but I hope that answers the question.
It does, and I'm also conscious that maybe the question was a little bit flawed, because you're right. I mean, if there's damage being done to someone, then call it whatever you want in a group setting. But I think where the question came from, Claire, was that I think it'd be useful, and maybe you don't have the information, but give us a sense as to the scale of cults in this country. How many members, how many survivors?
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer because a lot of survivors escape and go quiet. A lot of people aren't aware that they were in a cult. They may think that they've escaped a group that has harmed them, but they may not identify it as having been a cult. There are other people who may have left churches or organisations that were perfectly healthy, but they've had a negative experience and therefore they've called it a cult. It's a really difficult label that way. I've seen lists that range from 45 to 150 in the state of Victoria. I've heard speculation that there may be up to 3,000 in Australia. There's not intel on this at the moment. And this is something that we've suggested to government that there needs to be, but we've specifically said not a publicly held list of cults, because then you have the unintended consequence of people looking at a group and then assuming that they believe crazy things and that they're crazy people, but that's not actually what cults are. Cults aren't crazy people. Cults aren't about crazy beliefs. It is about control and domination. That is the problem with cults, not the belief. As far as I'm concerned, you can believe that Earth was colonised by sentient T-tails from the planet Neptune. Have at it, as long as you're not hurting people with this belief. But because of this,
who doesn't believe that, by the way?
I mean, I just tried to find something obscure, but if anybody's taken this personally, I'm dreadfully sorry, but, believe what you want. It's, there's all these different levers that we need to look at. But belief, as far as I'm concerned, belief isn't the problem. It's the mechanism by which the medicine is given. Probably not the medicine. It's the mechanism by which the Kool-Aid is drunk, And it's the mechanism by which that central charismatic or narcissistic character can exert so much control. But the problem is the control. I can't remember the question. Sorry about that.
Neither can I. No, I think let's keep moving.
Great.
You mentioned something a little earlier that caught my ear, and it was actually a question that I had loaded up. I was going to ask you, are more people born into cults than join? But I think you indicated that 63.4% of people, I might get that wrong, are born into cults and or are drawn into cults by people in cults. Yes. And you kind of you gave this great analogy of people, standing at train stations handing out flyers, and suggested that approximately 10% of people that join cults, join from the outside. Is there a is there a hierarchy within a cult between people that were born into that organization versus randoms that have just joined?
Yeah, good question. And I've just remembered what the other one was. It was about numbers of people in cults.
Oh, yeah, that's
Maybe
right.
we'll circle back to that because there are some important things happening in the environment at the moment, politically, economically, that is actually increasing the risk of radicalization into fringe groups at the moment. We'll come back to that. Come back to the sovereign citizen movement, Hebrew roots movement. We'll circle back.
I want to talk about that, yeah, for sure.
So this is a really fun question, and I mean that in a totally unfun way. Yes, there is a hierarchy, absolutely. So as a pastor's daughter, I was pretty high up in that hierarchy.
I can imagine, yeah.
And so 63.4% of people are either born into a cult or they were recruited through an intimate partner or family member. So that's that statistic, according to the self-reports of people who identified as being in a cult and wrote into this inquiry. Now, that is convenience sampling. I suspect that the amount of people born into cults would actually be a lot higher, but their ability to identify or self-identify as cult survivors and write in or do a questionnaire would be lower. Because how can you spot a red flag if you're raised in a sea of them? Like this, to the people born in, they might just view their parents as being controlling, or they might view their upbringing as being very strict, or they might have escaped and just tried to keep their head down. There's all sorts of motivations there. Around 10 or 11% of people who reported in had been recruited on a university campus or, something like that. They'd been invited to an event, essentially. This is how the Shincheonji cult is recruiting at the moment. University campuses and a lot around Melbourne Central Station, apparently. So we do have these street preacher types. We do have these handing out the flyers and all that kind of stuff. That's certainly something that we did, that my group did. We'd also do street singing, and we'd do letterbox drops and find random people on the street and prophesy over them. We do all that sort of thing. But essentially, a lot of cults look for periods of transition, hardship, or loss at which they can come alongside a person and support them. And that is the beginning of love bombing. And those times might be adolescence. It might be being overseas and studying at a university where you have never lived in this country before. And Shincheonji does recruit a lot of Asian students. They'll invite them to a Bible study, and it seems quite benign. And then once they're fully in, it's pretty extreme. But it's community, it's Bible study, and come along to this, and all feels very benign. But then they boil the frog, and it's the love bombing. But those periods of loss or transition, it could also be a divorce. It could be the death of a parent or a partner. It could be the diagnosis of a serious illness. It could be moving towns and looking for new community. It could be a falling out with your friend group. There's all these different risk factors. So what we used to do is we used to have prayer lists, and we would look for people who were quote unquote soft. And then their name would go on the prayer list. So let's say I have your name on my prayer list, Luke. I wouldn't have, because you're a boy and I'm a girl, and, we can't be trusted with each other, so we would never hang out one-on-one. But let's say you're a girl, Luke, and I've got you on my prayer list. I would then want to catch up for coffee with you. I want to hang out with you, and then I'd want to introduce you to another one of my friends, and then we would introduce you to another one of our friends, and then we would invite you into a barbecue or taco night or something like that. Now, it's all benign. You've just met some new friends and you've just been invited to a social event, but then you meet everyone and they're super nice and they're super interested and they laugh at your jokes and they care about your life, and then you're being invited to a lot of things, and this love bombing is intoxicating, all this attention. Then what happens is they might be like, Luke, I see that there's been some heartache in your life. Like, you're a really deep person and you're seeking out meaning. I can see that in you. Or it might be, I see that you've got really strained relationships with your kids. We're running this course on fatherhood. Or it might be for a woman, it might be, we're running this women's empowerment group. Or, there's different things that they'll invite you to, and that's how they begin the indoctrination process. So it was around 10% who were approached on a university campus or invited to an event. It was around 11 or 12% who were targeted during a time of loss, grief, or difficulty from memory. And then there was this 63% who were recruited through a friend, family member, intimate partner, or were born in. The born-in kids are an interesting phenomenon. There is an inherent hierarchy in groups like this, even though there is only really one authority figure, and that authority figure is dear leader. And then everything else is sort of this loose structure that is based on obedience to and proximity to that leader. So I had a lot of proximity. It's been interesting reading some of the reflections that people have had about me as they were writing into the inquiry. One person said that they saw me as sort of off limits, sort of in a gilded cage of sorts, that I seemed popular and I seemed like a big personality, but I also seemed like it was very hard to get close to me. It was interesting to read her reflections on that, because that's how I felt. I felt like I was sort of walled off from everybody else. Her observation was she felt like I was treated as a problem child because I was too thinky, or I asked too many questions, or I said what I was thinking, or and I felt like I'd lived my entire life trying not to get in trouble for those very things. So it's really interesting when somebody that you don't really have a relationship with echoes back your experience that way. You're like, oh, that wasn't just how I felt. Maybe this was actually what was going on. But I had a lot of privilege. So another thing that would happen is like church on Sunday morning is not real church for in my mind, because that's when the palatable aspects of the doctrine are preached. This is the stuff that they can put up on the podcast, although often they won't record their messages, or they'll censor the bits that are too extreme for public consumption. And back when I was in, I used to take the timestamps down when they would have to bleep out part of the messages, because we didn't want Dad to get in trouble, or we didn't want him to lose his job because he worked external to the church. So I had that kind of proximity. But real church, the real guts of the thing, was covenant group, which would happen on a Sunday night. Now, covenant group was invite only, and you didn't know whether you were going to get an invite until Sunday morning, when you'd see the church administrator, one of the aunties, weaving through the crowd and just giving people a tap and a wink. And that would be how you'd get invited to covenant group. Now, covenant group was at Mum and Dad's place. Usually we'd sit around on the floor, we'd sit around the fire in Mum and Dad's lounge room that had an open fire. We'd do some worship and pray in tongues, and then it would be God's telling, like Dad would be like, this is what God's telling me, this is the direction we need to move into, blah, blah, blah. And then there'd be like sharing, sort of mandatory sharing within that group, and you're giving your deepest secrets. And we knew who'd been Googling porn, and we knew whose marriage was difficult, and we knew who was being too thinky, and who was being rested from the roster, and whose daughter had stepped out of line. And it was really denuding, but also the degree of conformity that was expected in that group. They'd be like, oh, and what's God telling you? And after so many people have been like, oh, God's been telling me what God's been telling you, Pastor, you can't say anything different. You can't be like, well, God's telling me this. And they'd be like, well, you're listening wrong. You're tuning to the wrong frequency. And if you kind of argued back about some of the, directions that were given to you, you'd be sort of, there'd be blowback. So that sort of, that hierarchy it wasn't everyone was equal. It was Covenant group was that inner circle, but even within this inner circle, there was still that sense of there's the 12 disciples and there's Peter, James, and John. There were the people who could only get real close to that central character, and I felt like I was always left guessing where I was in that inner circle. And then one day, very suddenly, the invites to Covenant group stopped.
Yeah, you got your own invite to your own special Covenant group. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to just double click on something.
Double click on something. I love that.
On a topic that just I think you've maybe already covered or partially covered. Another author. I've been doing lots of research, Claire.
Love that for you.
Steve Hassan wrote a book called Combating Cult Mind Control. In the book, he says, no one joins a cult. They join a group they believe will bring them meaning. Mm-hmm. Did he get this right, or is there more nuance to that? It seems like, the one sort of ring to rule them all.
No, I think he's pretty accurate on that. Nobody joins a cult. They join the nicest group of people they've ever met who have this really lovely belief system and really beautiful relationships. At least that's what's portrayed on the outside. It's not until you're well and truly on the inside that you start to realize how much of your agency and personal freedom that you've given away. Interestingly, in the inquiry, the data that they came back with, 95.9% of people, I think it was, reported significant psychological abuse. 87.8 reported significant restrictions on their personal expression, or their personal agency, freedom, all that sort of thing. 52.4 said physical or sexual abuse. And I can't remember what financial exploitation was, but it was massive numbers. The thing is, he's absolutely right. Nobody chooses to join a cult. And there's this whole issue around consent here, because a lot of people think, well, whatever consenting adults do is up to them. Well, that's not how cults work. Consent, your ability to consent, your ability to resist, actually diminishes over time as you are, brought further and further into the cult. Because it starts with love bombing, which is really intoxicating, and you might not realize that your bonds to external friends or family are fracturing. And then as you're buying into their indoctrination and you're buying into their worldview, and this leader is being built up with an increasing sense of, mythology and power, and there's this existential aspect to it, and you're volunteering and you're tired and you're your meaning is ascribed to this group, and then soon you might be living with other members, you might be married to other members, you might they might have your superannuation, your kids might be involved. Like there's all sorts of things that can happen along that way, and you're actually no longer consenting, but you don't have the ability to not consent. So there is an issue there. Stephen Hassan is one of the bigger names in cult psychology and sociology. Increasingly, we're moving away from using the term mind control or brainwashing, because it's not, you can't wash somebody's brain. You can't actually rob them of who they are. You can suppress it. You can remove their ability to live authentically as themselves. Repression of sexuality or gender identity is something that's come across in the data really strongly. But even though I am a cisgender, straight, white woman, even my personality was repressed a lot because I was thought of as being too thinky. I was thought of as being too unsubmitted, problematic in different sort of ways. I can pretty much guarantee they still think of me as problematic, but I'm okay with it now, some days. But yeah, so there's mind control is salacious a little bit, but I like it better than brainwashing. Thought reform is a term that Robert Lifton uses, and that is basically putting all these restrictions around how a person can think. And Dr. Janja Lalich uses the term bounded choice, which is where our perception of our choices and the way we can think, feel, and act becomes so narrowed that we believe that we only have this amount of freedom that occurs within the group, its structures and its worldview. So there are, interesting terminologies there. But yes, Stephen is right on the money. Nobody joins a cult. They join something else.
Mm-hmm.
So,
at its most extreme, in your experience, having seen what you've seen and lived how you've lived, what does coercive control look like at its most extreme and its most benign?
That is an interesting question. I think over the course of the inquiry, every story you read is the worst story, we have this sort of very Aussie, very bleak joke about nobody wins the trauma Olympics, we all lose. But whether you've been in for 60 years or maybe a year or 18 months, that damage is very individual. It's very personalised. It's very personal. Kids in cults are a particularly tough one because, they don't have protective adults around them to go, hey, this kid hasn't been taken to the doctor when they should have been, like Elizabeth Struce from Queensland, who sadly passed away, a 12-year-old who died of diabetic ketoacidosis because her parents and their sect believed in prayer, not medicine. There've been a bit of a landmark case because every adult member of that sect has been sentenced to jail time, which is good because every adult member of that sect should have protected her. So that's been a landmark case. In my case, which I count as fairly, I don't think it's fair to classify people as more extreme or less extreme than me, so I'll refrain from doing that, but I was homeschooled. From a young age, I was helping homeschool my younger siblings. I was doing a lot of housework. I was babysitting a lot of the week. I was getting up early to do my schooling so that I could then do my house chores and then help with my siblings and then go and work at McDonald's, which was my mission field, and then go do all the church courses and volunteerism and all of the things that I had to do. But there was not a single person around me who was not under my dad who could raise an alarm about me or any of my siblings. So consequently, I had health issues growing up that were just not treated. And so I live with chronic pain. And there's other things that should have been picked up that weren't. Educational neglect is something that is commonly occurs in these groups, especially for girls, because they're thought of as being sort of, baby makers, or like, they need to submit to the man and they need to sort of run a household or something like that, and they don't need higher education. So a lot of them are actually pulled out of school as soon as legally okay. Some are homeschooled, like I mentioned, with myself, but increasingly sovereign citizen kind of crews, or like extremist groups like neo-Nazis even don't want their kids to be learning about pluralism and tolerance and respect. So they might be pulled out of the school system where well-being staff can't raise an alarm if they think a child's being abused or neglected. So there's these sort of problems that can happen in there. But as for where coercive control starts, it's invisible. That's the problem. The beginnings, the origins of coercive control are invisible. At its most extreme, then I think when there is control of sexuality or self-expression, that is when you've got a person completely, is when you can control who and who they have sex with, how they can have sex, what they're looking at on their phone or on the internet. If you can control that, even when you're not there, you've got someone completely under the thumb. But by the time a person gets there, where they're so living under the control of that central leader and their transcendent belief system. They've usually given over huge chunks of money. They've usually maybe submitted their career choices or their relationship choices to this group, to the leadership. They've, you know, like there's a lot that's gone into it at this point. And how you get there is, you know, you've given your secrets to this person through the process of thought reform, through the process of going through those courses and learning the sacred science and learning the language that brings you to the center of the group. By the time the group dynamics surround you and you feel like you're living under surveillance, usually because you are living under surveillance, cross accountabilities, it becomes a network of spies, the information gets straight back to the leader. There can be all sorts of buy-in. So the church that I came from, they bought their building using superannuation funds. So for a person to get their super out of that if they leave, I can't imagine would be easy. Obviously, I don't know how it's administrated. I just know that it exists, and that was the way that they'd always wanted to purchase the building. But it was restored using thousands of volunteer hours, and not all of them are likely to have been direct beneficiaries of that superannuation fund. So if you've got volunteers down scrubbing bricks and restoring an asset because God has promised this to, you know, like there's all sorts of things here. But Dad had a huge amount of influence on, well, who we'd marry, obviously. Like I was in an arranged marriage. I did have the opportunity to say no to that, and I'd said no to prior matches, but Dad was the one who set us up. And you know, there was gay conversion there, which was about control of sexuality, and but also like our efforts in politics. You know, it was thus saith the Lord, and go and take dominion, and that's what we did. And so there's a lot of life that can be coerced. I've added up the sums of how much money had gone into that. I had been essentially coerced into a business with somebody from inside the group, so I lost a lot of money that way. And, you know, it's a lot, but something that's come across in the data time and time again from other cult survivors, as in survivors of other cults, is coerced marriage, forced marriage. It was people who had reported assaults, sexual assaults, who were then told that you're biblically married to that man, go and be his wife. And, you know, reproductive choices being taken away from people. In extreme cases, the Twin Flames Universe cult, they've actually forced people to gender transitions. I mean, but with that said, there is always another story just as bad. And I do count myself lucky in so many ways, even though such a word should perhaps never be applied to a survivor of a coercive or high control group at all. But how does coercive control start? You don't even see it coming. You don't. It is boiling the frog degree by degree. And by the time you wake up to what's going on, yeah, it's hard.
I want to talk about the journey out of the group,
the good stuff,
the coercive group, the good stuff, the coercive group that you were born into.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that I was sitting here thinking, well, most people leave cults, but I think I heard you say a little earlier that you and your ex-husband were kind of pushed. How often does that happen?
Often. Yeah, often. As soon as somebody, and this is a statement I make not just based on my own experience, but based on a lot of reading and a lot of conversations with a lot of people, as soon as a person is thought of as being a threat to the group's integrity, I don't mean integrity as in doing the right thing. I mean integrity as in the group's strength. They are often managed out the door. So shunning is quite a common practice within groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Geelong Revival Centre practiced the type of shunning where the pastor would get up at the front and say, this person is now shunned. We no longer contact them. If you're a family member, they're not part of your family anymore. They're gone. So that kind of shunning that is mandated from the pulpit that way is awful, and it should be illegal. But shunning is a social phenomenon, in that if your whole life is wrapped up in a group and you believe the rest of the world is the enemy, and you believe that you are the one true way, and you believe you have the truth and that everybody else is attacking you, that as soon as somebody starts to have questions, it ruptures that sense of safety within the group, and then in an effort to protect itself, that group forces the person out. It's interesting because my experience and my ex-husband's experience were happening on exactly the same timeline, but they weren't the same experience because I'm a biological daughter of the pastor. He's the youngest of 4 siblings who were radicalized in one by one. So he sort of knew that as soon as he'd raised those questions with Dad, and the whole thing had gone south and there'd been an argument, he was like, well, there's no road back for us now. But I was like, no, this is my family. I have to fix it. So I fought for sort of 4 months to stay. But he was like, we're having a kid now. You do what you got to do to sort of go through the process, but we are out. So, but instantly, as soon as that argument had happened with Dad, and I got Mum and Dad back that night and tried to fix it, and it was awful. But as soon as that had happened, like our position within the social structure of the group changed like that. I started hearing a lot of whispers about my mental health and about how unstable I was, which is a common narrative. A, blame the woman, but B, make them crazy. And I couldn't correct any of these people because they weren't listening to me. We weren't getting invites to social stuff, and the conversations with Mum and Dad were really awkward. You walk into a room and you feel like all the eyes just turn on you all of a sudden.
Everyone's watching, yeah.
Oh, yeah. You're like, this is icky. And in order to regain your position in the group, it would take a big act of, I don't even know how. Like, I don't even know how I would have moved back to the centre of the group at that point. It seemed very clear that we were not welcome there, and because of the stress of that, my dad dodging my phone calls, me trying to set up meetings, they're not interested. Eventually, we had to leave with a letter, and sort of resigned from my family almost. It was really weird. No, I wanted to keep my family. I miss my siblings so much. I miss my mum. But, you know, it was just no place for us there anymore, and that was made very clear. But then, like, nothing was in writing and nothing had been said from the pulpit. So even though this social dynamic of shunning had happened, there's plausible deniability, and we never shunned them, they chose to leave. You know, you made us staying completely impossible and miserable, but sure, let's call it something else. So it's a really complicated sort of a thing. A lot of the people that I've spoken to who were shunned happened during late teenage years, where there's been some form of teenage exploration, and as a consequence they found themselves without friends, family or accommodation in a world that they do not know how to navigate. I've also a lot of, and this is hard, so I really hope that you put the number for Lifeline or Beyond Blue or Orange Door or 1-800-RESPECT at the beginning of this. Domestic violence, family violence within cults is quite common because of the strict control and strict gender roles that then are passed down. Often women who report assaults or report family violence or report abuse, women and girls, they're not believed, or they're told that they're to submit, or that they were at fault for the abuse for some reason. So escaping that means they also have to escape the cult, and they might get thrown back into harm's way. So for those who self-exit, there's a heap of problems. And that's part of the work that Ryan and Catherine from Stop Religious Coercion do, and that Laura McConnell-Conti from Truth 2x2s does, and that I do, is that when people go, how do I leave? We're like, okay, where are you? Who have we got near you? Have you got your passport, your license, your birth certificate? Is there a way that you can safely get this? Are you in mortal danger? Do you need us to call the police, or are we planning an exit more slowly? And at the moment, we are managing the recovery and support resources in-house with no budget. So, and it's all volunteer. So what we're hoping from this inquiry is that we'll actually be able to fund the desperately needed supports that survivors need, because some of us do need exit squads. Some of us do need places to live and retraining.
So you're actually helping people plan. You're actually helping people plan exits.
Yeah. And there's
because I can imagine
like
these. Some of these people are probably, they don't have the life skills or the knowledge to navigate, modern society, because they've been insulated for such a long period of time.
Yeah. Another classic one that is under a lot of media attention at the moment is the Plymouth Brethren Christian Centre. That is quite a well-known cult. The men often have jobs, but the women have no life skills. They have no connections outside, and it's terrifying. So, So to get out is hugely terrifying. It's very courageous. But I would say to somebody who's listening to this, it can be done, and we're here waiting on the other side to help and to support you. And government's not at the point where it fully gets it yet, but we've got their ear and we're working on that. And we've got therapists who understand cults now, so you don't have to explain your own damage to them. And we're moving towards training for frontline organisations and stuff like that. So there's a lot that's happening. But yeah, survivors need to be handled with a lot of dignity and a lot of care. And a lot of letting them take it at their own pace. If you need
it's not unlike healing from any major trauma, right? It's not linear.
Mm-mm.
It's circular. It ascends and descends, at the most outrageous times, and catches us unawares, I would imagine.
Oh yeah.
What are some of the things that would catch most people unawares? If they've been part of a coercive group and they've figured out that now's the time, I got to get out of here. What are the basics that you want to start thinking about before you actually make that move?
So first things first, if your immediate safety is an issue, just get out. Just call the cops, or, just grab a bag in the middle of the night and go. Like, just you do what you can. Like, we had one who was like, I've got 2 hours. And we were like, okay, we'll have a car there in an hour and a half. Like, have somebody on the outside that you can call. But if it's not that dire, and if your immediate safety isn't at risk, then there are some things that you can do just over time that will make it a bit easier. The first is know where your birth certificate, license, or passport is, if you have one. These documents will make it a lot easier to do things like get a bank account, or, somewhere that Centrelink can deposit your money when you exit. Even better is if you can open a bank account secretly and squirrel away some cash. That is amazing if you can do that. The cult that I escaped, or the high control group that I escaped, I was allowed to have a job and I was allowed to have my own bank accounts and all that kind of stuff. So I was lucky there, but some people don't, especially women. You want to just, if you have a friend on the outside, a family member, anyone that you can cultivate as who can help you with an escape plan, that you can be like, okay, I'm coming to your house and you're going to help me stay safe. That is amazing. And if that person can then take you to Centrelink, if that person can then take you to, housing services or employment services or anything like that, that is amazing. And you might have to say to them, I'm going to need some really practical help. I don't know what I need yet. One of our escapees, the one that we only had a couple of hours, I think she reached out to me a couple of months before she eventually gave us that crisis call. And I sort of thought that it might happen. But, a neighbour who was moving out of their house said to her, I've got a whole house full of furniture that you can just have. And, like when we finally got this young lady housed, the community was so ready to just help her. So I think it's important to know that people are fundamentally, nice. We've been taught to fear the outside world, but I found that the outside world was ready to embrace me. They had their suspicions that I was in a cult. I remember one person coming around to do my nails when I was heavily pregnant. And she said to me, like very carefully, like she'd offered to do my nails, which was really odd, but I was like, screw it. I could use a bit of pampering. So she came around and then she said, so I heard a rumor that you've had a falling out with your dad and you've left the church. But I said that couldn't possibly be true. She was like giving me the side eye. And I was like, no, that's true. I've been shunned. And then all of a sudden the distance between us evaporated and she was like, I saw what it was. What do you need? How can I help?
Wow.
And it's very vulnerable to say to people, yes, I need help. But you do, and that's okay. And we're here. And if you get to put in a phone call to somebody like Ryan or Catherine or Laura or me, then we can make this a little bit easier. It's not going to be super easy. Recovery is long, and it's loopy. Recovery is a tangled ball of string. It is not linear, but I look around at my life now and there are patches of grief and darkness, but I'm so lucky. Even when I just check on my kids at night and just see them sleeping peacefully in their beds in a house that isn't crammed to the rafters with boarders and people who are not family, and when I see them able to just have difficult conversations with me because they feel safe with me and they can just say things without shame, I think this is what I dreamed of. And then everything else is icing on the cake. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Claire, I do want to be respectful of your time. I've only got a couple more questions to ask you. Your group has authored a paper that we've spoken about, Beyond Belief, that's been submitted to a parliamentary inquiry in Victoria. Why is law reform in this space so important? How are laws not currently supporting survivors?
So in Beyond Belief, we actually mapped out 21 different government departments and 30 different acts, 30 different areas of law that actually hold a tiny bit of the cult problem within their remit, but they don't have the power to talk to each other. So what I mean by that is, like, child abuse is of course covered under law, but cults tend to cover that up. Modern slavery would be applicable to labour exploitation. Fraud comes under, the financial stuff. A lot of these groups behave like organised crime gangs in the way that they move money, labour, in the way that they treat people. So there's all these different areas of law, but there are gaps. So we've got these bricks, but we need the mortar between. We need law reform to fix these gaps. Cults use legitimacy shields. So the Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse The Truth 2x2 survivors, they couldn't feed into that because the Truth 2x2s are unregistered. So they weren't able to get recourse out of that. The redress scheme is another way that people can get compensation, but not all cults sign up to that. Fringe sects that might be breakaways from bigger organisations are, but a lot of these groups are tiny and independent and they don't sign up to redress, which means you have to take them to court in a civil action, and that's often too traumatic for people. So there's all of these different areas, but they don't talk to each other. So we are moving for group-based coercive control as an area of law reform that puts a cult lens over the top of this and fills in those gaps, that brings these different areas of law together. But a major recommendation from us is actually an independent commission for cults and high control groups. And that independent commission, it needs to not sit under a minister, because if you have a far right or far left, for that matter, a fringe minister who then gets into Parliament and takes that over, they can axe the department or they can interfere with investigations. So it needs to be independent. But that commission, their job would be to take these reports and to triage them and say, okay, well, the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission has this area, child protection has that area, housing has that area. So they can farm out these reports, but also follow up and make sure that they're not going to be forgotten, because often people will be triaged out of the system because it's out of sight, out of mind, but also it might sit just outside the remit of a department and they go, oh, that's not my problem, and they'll fire it through to somebody else. So that independent commission would be there to make sure action can be taken and make sure that it can be understood, because these cults can be sort of these nebulous sort of organisations that are often structured to evade scrutiny, and really having an independent commission would fix that. But we need legislative reform so that that commission has the right sort of investigation powers, coercive powers, to actually take action. And finally, legislation usually is necessary before government funding can be attached to something. So we desperately need funding for recovery, for escaping, for setting people up with life on the outside, and all this sort of thing. So many, many things, but law reform is the place to start.
Yeah. Look, before I let you go, I do want to talk about Christian nationalism and sovereign citizens and the linkage between those two factions and coercive control. What would you have people know about the connection between those three groups?
Okay, great question. Not a quick one, but let's dive in. Right. So Christian nationalism is an ideology. It is a belief, usually by nations colonised by the West, essentially. This idea that the nation is founded on Judeo-Christian values, and that adherence to those Judeo-Christian values is essentially what will build up a nation or drive it to ruin. It is often a reflex, a blowback against social progress. So Christian nationalism is very anti-woman, anti-LGBT. It is usually white supremacist, and we're seeing this increasingly in the United States. Anti-choice, all of these sorts of things. Increasingly anti-no-fault divorce. They're wanting to take women's rights back. There's been talks about repealing women's rights to vote, and really it's quite nasty. Not everyone who is Christian nationalist will identify as Christian nationalist. They may have these beliefs that are anti-queer, anti-woman. They may believe in male headship. They may be white missionaries who go to evangelize brown communities, but they may not recognise that that's a very white-centric way of viewing the world. But people can be radicalised further and further out into the more hardcore iterations of Christian nationalism. But it is very, very much linked with the religious and fringe right, which is where this interesting Venn diagram kind of kicks in. The religious and fringe right also commonly has an apocalyptic worldview. commonly believes that social progress is of the enemy, it's satanic, it needs to be overthrown. A lot of this kind of comes together in a really concerning way because they'll view the government as lower than God. They'll view God's ways as higher than the ways of man. God's law is higher than the law of man. So a lot of them may fully justify child marriage, may fully justify owning guns, stockpiling ammunition, even though it's not legal in their jurisdiction or whatever. A lot of them are fully doomsday preppers. But Christian nationalism isn't a cult per se. Christian nationalism is an ideology. And like I said, ideology, the transcendent belief system, is what helps the medicine go down. It's what helps the Kool-Aid go down. At the moment in society, we have a few overlapping problems that create the perfect petri dish for this to become a problem. And that is, first of all, everyone, including you and I, everyone with an internet connection and a microphone and a webcam can start a podcast or a channel, and we can end up with online radicalization into these fringe ideologies. Sovereign citizen as an ideology comes out of this white nationalist, Christian nationalist sort of thing, and even though there are people of colour in the sovereign citizen movement, of course, but they're anti-government. And the Wyambula shootings that happened, the Train brothers were consuming huge amounts of this online talk. They came from a religious background, and then they're listening to this talk and it radicalizes them. But then, of course, they're quite well networked individually, like a lot of sovereign citizens know each other, and that's when cults can pop up. So Desi Freeman has become quite a charismatic character within this. But also you look at more extreme groups like the National Socialist Network. Tom Sewell has definitely got the look of a cult leader about him. And we're seeing control mechanisms come in there, and their transcendent belief system is, Hitler's gospel. And that's really Australia for the white man. But they're prepping for an ethno-state. They're prepping for a race war. And they believe themselves to have their own sort of law unto themselves. So it's really dangerous when you've got a charismatic character like Tom Sewell, who then emerges as the mouthpiece of this disenfranchised group who all happen to have this similar ideology. That's when it can morph into a cultic group. Earlier I mentioned that the situation is exactly right in society for these groups to emerge. And what I mean by that, not only have we got influencer culture, we've got these leaders can emerge with no training, with no ethics, with no accountability, and they get intoxicated off the power that they can have over people. They believe that their truth is the truth and their belief is the one true way. But also, in addition to that, if people have been raised with an apocalyptic worldview, they're going to look around and see sort of the signs of the end times. They're going to see the four horses of the apocalypse they're going to see it as a warning. Now, one of these is conflict in Israel. And so they're going to see wars and rumours of wars being the pale horse. They're going to see COVID-19 as, pestilence. They're going to see they're going to see the cost of living crisis, progressive agenda as the antichrist. So they're going to look around and feel that uncertainty and attribute that incorrectly to the end of the world coming near. And that's where we have doomsday preppers. And that's when we have these isolationist sects that develop. And they have a very deep devotion to these ideas. You can't argue them out of it. So we need to hold this particular phenomenon with a lot of compassion, because othering them and arguing with them and treating them like idiots is only going to inflame their persecution complex. So we need to also understand that we have, as humans, a fundamental drive towards tribe and meaning and connection. And often when these disenfranchised people find that tribe and connection in these damaging or noxious groups, it is answering a need in them that society hasn't. And if we bunker down and don't allow them space to come back from that and participate in a healthy group again or in a healthy society again, we've got a real issue. So the sovereign citizen movement is not a cult per se, but there would be several cultic sects within that are kind of banding around a central charismatic leader, Christian nationalism, doomsday prepping, sovereign citizen beliefs. They're the ideology that becomes the transcendent belief system, but it's when they kind of band together around one controlling narcissistic character that you actually do have the development of a fringe sect. At the moment, it's a bit hard to measure. There's could be up to 50,000 Hebrew roots movement adherents, and that's not Jewish people. That is people who've appropriated Jewish culture in these high control fringe sects. So that often they connect with the sovereign citizen movement as well, and it's really interesting. It's complicated.
Yeah, it sounds complicated. So many layers of stuff here to sift through and sort through. Just when I thought I had a handle on cult groups and coercive control, and you throw the linkage in between Christian nationalism and sovereign citizens. Claire, is there anything that we haven't spoken about today about your work that is burning a hole in your pocket, and we just haven't had a chance to talk about it?
Look, I think we've talked about enough today, to be quite honest, Luke. It's interesting. I stepped into this space when I was deconstructing, and when I thought that the group that I was in was cool and normal, and I was the problem. And over time, I've deconstructed that a lot more, and that's what's brought me into talking about Christian nationalism. And originally, I was supposed to be writing a book on that this year. My agent said I needed to get across into TikTok, and so I did. And that's how I met Ryan and Catherine, and we started working on the cult law reform thing. And it's really, the cult stuff has taken up so much of my concentration this year, but I need to move back across to talking about Christian nationalism. I'll do that next year, but go follow me on Substack and, TikTok or whatever. And there's a lot more to be talked about, but there's separate issues. They overlap, but there's separate issues. Cults are not about belief. It's not about ideology. It's about control. Christian nationalism is about ideology, and it is about belief. It's two separate issues, but they do overlap.
Yeah. Claire, I want to thank you. Honestly, you've done such a great job of leading me by the hand and taking me through, and my audience through this space. So thank you. It's such a sensitive, complex topic, and I think you do such a great job of articulating this in a way that is consumable and easy to understand. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge your courage too. I mean, what you've been through personally, being able to advocate for a group of survivors and manage your own trauma and healing and recovery, that's not lost on me either. So hat tip to you for all the stuff that you do and all the volunteer work that you and your colleagues do. This is not paid stuff. This is stuff that you're doing off your own bat. Because you clearly have compassion in your heart for people and survivors, and also your own family. I heard the compassion with which you spoke about your own, blood family that you don't get a chance to spend time with. So I acknowledge all of that and see all of that, and I just want to thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been lovely, and thank you for your kind words. It's a long road ahead, but I think our powers combined, we can get it done.
Thanks, Claire.